So which of the Warhammer 40k armies are doing well or badly on the tabletop right now? Let's talk through every single faction in the game, how strong they're looking, and what are the mightiest things that they can put on the table in their best army builds. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a big one and talk through the general state of the meta in Warhammer 40k right now, with a broad overview of which armies seem to be doing strongest and weakest by the numbers and why. We've now had around about 5 or 6 weeks worth of data from 40k factions in open conflict since the last balance update. There was some downtime over the Christmas period, and we've had a few updates, notably for Necrons recently, though quite a bit of time for plenty of people to be testing out new rules for their factions, and plenty of big tournaments to show what stuff seems to work at the higher levels. There's plenty of different stat sites that track Warhammer 40k data. I'll leave lots of good ones linked down in the video description. I've taken a look at a whole variety of them for making this one, plus Best Coast Pairings to take a look at a whole bunch of army lists. For these ones I usually tend to go through army power in order of grand tournament win rate, starting with the lowest and going through to the strongest. It's not the only measure of performance, but I think it's probably the most helpful general purpose one, as it represents players of a faction going in with an army that's at least somewhat strong, and trying to do their best against others in somewhat controlled conditions. It feels like a fairly good measure of a typical player's experience, though to pair with that let's also look at some casual win rate data from Goonhammer, which is taken from their app, which armies are getting taken to tournaments the most, showing a bit of overall sentiment for each faction, and also a look at their top table successes, how many armies have either won tournaments or have gone 5-0 undefeated for the first 5 games, as that better highlights the things doing well at the top levels of play, and particularly when you weight it for play rates of numbers of people taking those armies. Overall at the moment though, as it has been for a lot of recent history, 40k game balance really isn't too bad compared with its past. It doesn't hold true for every army, but the vast majority of factions have strong builds that they can put on the table, and a good player with a strong army list can do well with the vast majority of factions in the game into most others, which definitely hasn't always been the case. There's always certain armies that are stronger and weaker though, some of which are outside Games Workshop's previous targets of 45 to 55% win rates, a few on the lower end, and one notably sticking out the top. It's not really the end of the world balance-wise, but it's still a little annoying when you have one army at least that seems to be notably stronger than most of the other things out there. Starting with the lower end of the power spectrum though, these are the armies that seem to be performing lowest in terms of tournament win rates right now. At least at grand tournaments, compared with most of their peers, they seem to be doing a bit worse and are harder to win with, though even here I'd bear in mind that even these factions are winning 4 out of 10 games or more. They're certainly not unplayable casually, though it's certainly going to be more of a struggle to top tournaments with them. Here we have the Imperial Agents, the Imperial Knights, Black Templars and Chaos Space Marines. We'll start putting them on the graph as we go along. As usual, I've left off the Imperial Agents as they just don't really tend to have data due to so low play rates with the army. There's not really a lot new to say about the Imperial Agents. It looks like for this meta they've got grand tournament win rates for around 34%, though it's kind of meaningless as there's so few people playing them. They're the least played army in Warhammer 40k, the cobbled together faction made out of Inquisition and Kill Team box sets, and Games Workshop have chosen not to really balance them as a standard faction in Warhammer 40k, getting absolutely nothing at all in the last balance pass. When they are put on the table in anger, people tend to go for the Imperialis Fleet detachment, which has got a useful general purpose detachment rule and has some nice movement tricks. Their gameplay often tends to more revolve around waves of chaff, scoring objectives and move blocking the enemy, so you might get quite a lot of the Voidfarers and Imperialis Fleet, maybe some Subdoctor squads as they're fairly tanky, and perhaps a good bunch of henchmen and things jumping out of Chimeras. Kyria Draxus is an efficient datasheet, as are the Assassins, particularly being able to swap them out, and if you want a bit of focal damage dealing, Deathwatch veterans are likely the way to go there. As per normal, Games Workshop really needs to give their core rules a decent boost. They don't have an in-faction way to deal with tanks and monsters, they don't have a core army rule that doesn't just involve adding their models to other armies, but so far there's no indication that Games Workshop's going to help them out. Next up towards the lower end of the power spectrum are the Imperial Knights. They've got 42% win rates, dropping down 4% from the previous balance pass. Their win rates do seem to be higher in casual play, 47% from Goonhammer, that's fairly common for Knights. Though it looks like they've got 0 top tournament 5-0 undefeated runs, and are really quite low played at the moment relative to their normal, down at 20th out of the 28 factions. The Knights had their period of being ridiculously overpowered, then got nerfed hard, and the Codex was more of a nerf than a buff. Since then, their win rates were on the lower end of the 40k spectrum, and then if anything, probably overall got a nerf in the last balance pass. A few Titanic Knights went down 10 points, which is in no way really significant on a 400 point model, but it was also paired with a nerf to their army rule, making it significantly harder to get the command point reward for achieving their easiest quest. The stronger options on the tabletop currently, Questoris Companions and Spearhead at Arms, seem to be rivaling for the strongest attachments. They're the ones focused on the big knights and the little knights respectively. Valor Lance does get some play, but even less success than the first two. None are really doing well in a tournament setting. For their units, they do have quite a lot of playable datasheets. Out of the Titanic Knights, the melee Lancer, the tank-busting Cerastus Atropos, the powerful shooting of the Castellan and the Crusader, and balanced Canis Rex with those discounted stratagems are all fairly solid Titanics. The Castigator, Warden and Defender are all quite nice in Spearhead, getting more out of their bondsman abilities. And then both Warglaves and Helverins often make up a good chunk of armies, and obviously go heavy on them if you're playing Spearhead at arms. Many other Titanic datasheets are at least fairly playable as well, and most armies tend to take some allied agents like the Calidus Assassin to bounce around doing objectives, or sticky objectives with split squads of sisters in Immolators. Basically, they've just swung from being rather overpowered to being on the sort of lower mid to weak side of things, and then if anything nerfed further really. Overall, they're just lacking for a bit of raw power and could do with some further points cuts to push them a bit more mid-tier. Knights in general tend to be a little bit simplistic to play and tend to do better at casual play compared with competitive, and don't seem to be super standout in casual play either right now. And I suspect they're not really going to have a great time against Necron Katarn either, who can likely do the stat check thing better than them. Next up, and slightly higher on 44% win rates, we have the Black Templars. They seem to have fallen off in quite a big way since the previous meta, dropping down 6%, and the win rates seem to be fairly consistent with casual play. No big tournament wins yet, and one of the lesser played factions in the game, 24th out of the 28 armies, which while they're not super widely played, is still on the low side for them, and does look like it reflects a loss of enthusiasm following the previous nerfs. I did think that the Black Templars were treated rather harshly in the last balance pass. They were kind of mid-tier before, and then they got nerfs to some of their best datasheets with the Castellan, Emperor's Champion and Reporter Executioner going up, and the buffs to some slightly lesser played characters didn't make up for it. Recently they did gain access to the Bastion Task Force, one of the tightest detachment that works quite well for them with their fighty characters and Crusader squads. It does seem to be getting some competitive play. It looks like it's been winning or placing highly in really quite a good number of one-day tournaments. Though for grand tournaments it still seems that more people are going for the Gladius Task Force as they were before. It supports Templar melee rather well with advance and charge, fights on death and useful things for various other units in the army, and it's still one of their biggest criticisms that they don't have a themed Black Templar detachment that really does a general purpose melee buff for the army better than Gladius does. For notable units, most of their iconic stuff is quite strong. Gladius lists often tend to take multiple 4 or 5 man Sword Brethren squads, typically led by a Marshal and Castellan. They're just very dangerous for the amount of points and the sheer amount of auto wounds at damage 2 they can throw out. Crusader squads are getting a bit more use now, maybe just the one unit of 10 in Gladius, but some are going heavier in Bastion. Various character combos can work out pretty well with them. The Emperor's Champion's very fighty and quite nice to lead assault intercessors, maybe with the Honour Vehement and Gladius. Both Grimaldus and Helbrecht are also nice for the cost. They can be reasonable enough with assault intercessors or with Crusader squads potentially. And with their multi-melter tanks, maybe the most standout ones are the Repulsor Executioner, despite the points increase, still probably the best firepower that they have access to. And the Templar Impulsor's rather nice as well. Both the assault intercessor squads and the Sword Brethren quite like to stage out of it. So getting an efficient datasheet with a bolt-on multi-melter is pretty helpful. You can back that all up with a good amount of the standard Space Marine support units like Combi Lieutenants, Scouts and Intercessors. Overall though, it just doesn't really seem to be coming together for the Black Templars currently. I feel like those previous nerfs just weren't really necessary and seem to have helped flip them from a fairly well balanced army to one that's more standout weak once again. Feels like they could just do with a few small points buffs to units that are already strong, and ideally a themed Templar melee detachment of some description. Lastly, for the armies that seem to be on the lower end of the win rate points at the moment, we've got Chaos Space Marines. They're on 45% or 44% casually. Sort of mid-play rates at the moment at 13th, though it's still kind of lowish for them given how popular they are. They have had a little top tournament success with 3 lists going 5 games undefeated, though it does look like those 3 have been really quite unusual ones. I believe it's 2 Fellhammer Siege hosts and 1 Soulforged pack, which is kind of the exact opposite of the ones that tend to get played and success in competitive play, which more tend to be Renegade Raiders, Pat-bound Zealots, Veterans of the Long War, Creations of Bile, and a few people making the Chaos Cult work with their Accursed Cultists and board control. With the last balance passes, they didn't have enormous changes. The Forge Fiend and the Terminator Lord went down a touch. Fabius Bile went up a bit, which is relevant I guess, as he's quite a strong datasheet to run with some Chosen potentially. They gained the Nightmare Hunt detachment as an upgrade on the Dread Talons, though it still doesn't seem to have done enough to punch through to competitive despite having multiple buffs. And they traded out their Raptor datasheets. The new one's more expensive, but comes with a bit more hitting power, though it might not be overall too helpful for their small unit skirmish role that they tended to have before. For stronger units, they do have quite a lot of playable options now. Lord Discordant's a nice HQ choice. Either Chosen or Legionaries with a Lord jumping out of a Rhino tends to be a staple. Cultists are auto-include for their sticky objectives. Some allied Nurglings very nice to screen the midboard. Bikers are cheap efficient skirmish squads. There's plenty of flavours of fire support that do well. Vindicators, Obliterators and Predators, with Forge Fiends and Vindicators being good too. Cypher's hard to pass up as a very dangerous lone operative. Fabius Bile works well with Chosen, as some of the detachments push you in different ways for units. Say Creations of Bile is usually going to be good for melee heavy stuff, perhaps taking a bunch of Possessed, and Warp Talons can have some fun shenanigans as well. Overall though, they still seem to be a little bit on the lower powered side overall, and there's a good number of detachments that are slightly on the weaker side compared with some. It doesn't seem the Nightmare Hunt's quite broken through for Night Lords players, and several of the others like the Alpha Legion themed one leave something to be desired. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, In Neon Forge Studio. They're a commission painting studio based in Poland, though they can ship worldwide, active since 2019. I'll post a few of their awesome paint jobs up on the screen right now. There's a few epic looking designs for some Aeldari here. Generally the idea with them and most commission painters is that you reach out to them if you've got an idea for a centerpiece model, a squad or an entire army that you want them to paint up, and they'll work with you to work out a colour scheme, decide what you want, and price up the work in terms of how long it's going to take them to get the job done, which might vary a bit depending on colour scheme and any other fancy things that you'd like done. They're happy to chat either via email or video call if that's easier for you. I must admit, plenty of cool looking paint jobs here, lots of seriously glowing looking vehicles. They tend to charge somewhere around the $40 mark per 28mm base model to around $400 to $600 per some of the largest models like Imperial Knights. It can vary a lot depending on the scheme though. In any case, feel free to check out their website or reach out to them, link down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at their stuff or seek out a quote. And in any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving onwards and upwards, here are a bunch of factions that are maybe on the slightly lower mid-end of Warhammer 40k. Win rates between 46 to 48%. Realistically, they're not in a terrible spot game power wise, not so very far away from 50%, but at the same time it does feel like these ones broadly correlate with armies that haven't been winning as many tournaments or placing high so far, and aren't quite as easy to win with compared with some of the top dogs for the average player. Ranked in this section we have Chaos Knights and Aeldari on 46%, and then World Eaters, Tyranids, Emperor's Children and Orks on 47%. Starting with the Chaos Knights, they're on 46%, which has dropped down about 5% compared with pre-update. Again, like the Imperial Knights, their win rates are higher in casual play. In a more casual setting, more armies are unable to handle the stat check that is Knights. Again, like the Imperials though, they don't seem to have had any tournaments with the first 5 games undefeated just yet, and aren't being taken to grand tournaments in a particularly wide way at the moment. Their play rate 17th out of 28. For the last balance pass, they basically had their dual Gatling Despoiler nerfed. That datasheet went up 15 points, which isn't crazy on one night, but if you were taking 3 of them, it's at least something. And a couple of small buffs to a couple of the other Titanic datasheets, including the Ruinator, though nothing too meaningful. Broadly, it doesn't really seem like it's changed all that much for Chaos Knights right now. It still seems that Infernal Lance is hugely on top compared with the other detachments in the competitive scene. Dual Gatling Despoilers with lethal hits can still pretty well delete most things out there. The core rule's helpful for other knights as well, and they have access to Diabolic Bulwark. Lords of Dread and Helmpack Lance are the next most played, though far rarer to see on tournament tables. It seems that the Dual Gatling Despoiler Knight is still pretty well top dog on the Titanic Knight front, often backed up by multiple War Dog Carnivores, maybe a Stalker with Scout or so. Knight lists often go at least fairly heavy on the allied demons. It's not uncommon to see multiple units of Nurglings and Beasts for some small unit support, and occasionally things like Plague Bearers or Rottagus. Beyond that, most of the other Titanic Knights are at least playable. Things like the Rampager, Lancer, Abominance, Desecrator and Tyrant are nice enough, as are the other War Dogs. They just maybe don't feel like quite as standout as the Dual Gatling Despoiler or the War Dog Carnivore right now. Overall, it does feel like the biggest issue is having quite so much of the army strength all tied to one datasheet, which isn't the most interesting one to play in the world. It's fairly point and delete with a lot of things, though still can't handle every target. It won't like Catan all that much. It feels like you need more of the other big knights to really be a serious rival in terms of power for that, probably by buffing them as opposed to further nerfing the Despoiler. And knights in general are always likely to be a faction that tends to do better in casual play versus top tier competitive, just due to having bigger models and fewer sneaky tricks. Next up, the Aeldari fell down the rankings quite a bit, dropping down to 46% wins, a big 8% drop compared with pre-update, as they had lots and lots of their units nerfed, most of their key aspects, Phoenix Lords, and the big combo of Fire Dragons jumping in and out of a Wave Serpent all took hits, and they now basically look like an army that's struggling a fair bit by most metrics. Their more casual win rates are even lower, down at 44% it would seem. Their play rate is quite incredibly low for them, dropped down to 19th out of 28 factions, so 15 places compared with last time around, though those players do seem to actually be doing alright at getting a few top placings. There were 4 lists that had some 5-game undefeated initial runs, which isn't too bad by the play rate. It seems that 2 of those were Seer Councils, 1 an Aspect Host and 1 a War Host. After the nerfs, it still seems that Aspect Host is the single most played, though people are experimenting with most of the other detachments far more than they were before. A good number of people are using the Harlequin's Serpent Brood, which is doing alright with a few RT2 wins, but the Harlequins don't really seem to be a major force at a grand tournament level. For most of their more common picks, they do seem to be fairly similar to how they were before. Fire Dragons plus or minus Fugan for anti-tank, Dark Reapers, Lycus and Jane Czar, plus Howling Banshees and Warp Spiders. Plenty of scoring units like Rangers, Storm Guardians, Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders to rush around doing objectives and skirmishing with infantry. Perhaps Eldrad could hang out with the Storm Guardians. Maybe a few of the other data sheets are seeing a little more play. Things like War Walkers, the Falcon, the Warlock Skyrunner and Striking Scorpions a touch more than before. And then much of the rest depends on different attachments being played, such as more Seers in Seer Council. Overall though, Aeldari have dropped down the rankings really quite a lot to be one of the weaker armies in 40k right now. It did seem likely they'd got a bit over-nerfed when they first got their points changes, and after the nerf of the cookie cutter Aspect Warrior build, it doesn't really seem that they've managed to find something a bit more mid-tier to take its place just yet. Might be nice to see a bit of help for Inari and Wraith host attachments as well, which still seem to be notably weak even compared with the Aeldari list post-nerfs. Next up, we've got the World Eaters on win rates of 47% or so. They look like they've dropped down just a fraction compared with pre-update, though their more casual win rates are still up on around about 49%. It still looks like there's lots of enthusiasm to put the Violent Boys of Khorne on the tabletop, the 6th most played competitive army out of the 28, and have had a fair number of top placings. 4 players managing to go 5 games undefeated or get tournament wins, though it's kind of lowish if you actually weight it for the large number of people choosing to play them currently. The last balance changes had more unhelpful stuff compared with buffs for the Berserkers. The Slaughterband got a points nerf, as did the Juggernaut Lord, which means that fewer people are playing the big 20 squads of Khorne Berserkers now, and a couple of the enhancements for the Berserker Warband went up as well, though they still remain useful. On the flip side, they did get some points decreases for the Goremongers, making them a lot more tempting for an infiltrate screen for your scouts, and Angron went down a bit, and it has been nice to see that he's actually got to the point where a fair few armies have actually been putting Angron on the tabletop. Someone's managed to go undefeated with the Red Angel as well. In general, in competitive play, people use the Berserker Warband. It just gives you a lot more useful violence compared with the rest. +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, lots of useful stratagems, and the enhancements are good. Lists tend to have some good small objective support, with Spawn to rush and trade with lighter things. Jackals are nice for their sticky objectives, Goremongers are good for the infiltrate. Khorne Berserkers, particularly in Rhinos with Khan, are very nice to have. The Demon Prince is still pretty reasonable, particularly with that Helm of Ire for the -1 damage. It makes them a lot harder to kill. Both varieties of 8-bound are strong and scary elite damage dealers in their own way, and often still choose to take the Slaughterband along even at the higher points cost. And for some vehicle support, both Forge Fiends and Hellbrutes are pretty standout, with lots of punchy close range firepower and their multiple fighting thing. Overall, it looks like their win rates have dropped a touch compared with previously. They are a bit more niche than they might have been. There's still some data sheets that seem a bit overshadowed, maybe Lord Invocatus out of the unique things. Angron's still not particularly stand out, and some other things that you might hope could be better like the Terminators or the Lord of Skulls are a bit weaker. Perhaps one of the biggest things on the wish list might be something to shake up the detachments just a bit. Berserker Warband's very good, but it's maybe a shame to have it standing head and shoulders above the rest quite so much as it does. Overall, while their numbers might be a touch on the mid-side, they're still absolutely doing solidly enough in the hands of a good player. Next up, and also on 47%, we have the Tyranids. They've dropped down 2% compared with the last meta, though it looks like the more casual win rates from Goonhammer for some reason are up on 52%. For whatever reason, the Bugs from Beyond seem to be doing better on the more casual tables out there. They don't really seem to be having much success on the top tables of competitive play currently, just the one of those top placing runs, so really quite low by the large amount of people playing them. They remain a popular faction within 10th edition, and are 8th most played at tournaments recently. The last balance changes for the Nids were pretty light touch. They had buffs both to the Streamer Killer Carnifex and the regular Carnifex, which you might take with Old One Eye. Both of those are playable enough data sheets right now. And in terms of strong army list, they've got plenty of options. The main 2 competitive detachments are Invasion Fleet with its damage buffs, 5+ Feel No Pain, and Regenerating Gaunts, and Subterranean Assault with its focus on the Tunneler units and able to burrow around the battlefield and get your scary melee things in close if you want to. Vanguard Onslaught, Crusher Stampede, and Assimilation Swarm also do well enough in their own way as well. For standout units, there's several solid bugs to be primary damage dealers. Exocrines, Maleceptors, the Norn Emissary, and the Tyrannifex are probably the best bets for slaying heavies or Terminators. Having one of the command bugs in residence is a pretty popular option. Hive Tyrants can buff some of the above firepower and also give you free stratagems, and the Swarm Lord can be pretty helpful to have that aura of +1 command point to disrupt the enemy. The Tyranids have got great lone operatives, particularly the Lictor and Neurolictor, excellent for skirmishing plus bringing other advantages. A Biovore is pretty much mandatory to score points with spawned Spore Mines. Some Endless Multitudes will be nice to sweep the enemy off the objectives with OC temporarily. Some of the Vanguard units can be pretty hard-hitting damage dealers in their own right. Brood Lord plus Genestealers, nice in Vanguard Onslaught or an Invasion Fleet, and Raveners are fairly chunky damage dealers and work well in Subterranean Onslaught too. And Euro Tyrant's fairly bad for buffing Shadow in the Warp and can join Zone Throbes for some powerful anti-tank. and then plenty of the detachments might push you a little bit in one way for the units, maybe a Trigon Prime in the Burrowing detachment, perhaps some Harvesters in Assimilation Swarm. Overall, they still feel fairly well balanced. Maybe their biggest issue is often struggling against the big tough stat check armies out there, and are often forced to sort of win the game via board control, secondaries and battle shock style things, which they are strong at, but does mean that they're going to struggle into certain matchups. Certainly Tyranids are going to be one of the armies that maybe struggle the most to deal with Necron Catan while they're running around now, more needing to maybe kind of hopefully manage them as opposed to destroy them outright. Next up, and also on 47%, we have the Emperor's Children. They've risen up a touch since the last balance pass, plus 2% compared with the previous 45. Their more casual win rates are a little bit higher than this. They're doing okay for some event wins, with 4 players managing to go 5-0 undefeated or win tournaments, though that's still not super standout when you weight it per play rate, as they're quite popular on the tournament scene currently, the 9th most played faction out of the 28. Broadly, it feels like they're in an okay mid-tier spot by most metrics here. The last balance changes brought one important nerf to the Winged Demon Prince. They went up in points for the Prince that can fly about and then hit the enemy very hard with a bunch of impact hit mortal wounds, though it doesn't seem to have stopped them being spammed in a whole bunch of competitive lists. Otherwise, they have buffs to Spawn, Terminators, the Footprints, the Keeper of Secrets and Shalaxi Hellbane. The Rapid Evisceration detachment got a small buff, and the Court of the Phoenician was added in as a new detachment focusing more on melee, and it does seem to have actually been interesting enough that lots of people have tried it out in competitive play. Despite this, it does still seem that Coterie of the Conceited is the way that most people choose to go. More people are playing that, and it seems to be doing better by the tournament metrics and win rates. It has access to some fairly easy damage buffs and some alright supporting stratagems. Though the court detachment is quite nice to have a credible alternative if you want to play something different, it's still doing well enough. The Emperor's Children have got a very limited roster, and basically all of their unique stuff is at least playable. Multiple squads of Lord Exaltants with Infractors tend to be a staple to skirmish and drag down enemy elites. Norse Rain and Rhinos tend to get run maximally a lot of the time, maybe with a Lord Cacophonist to hand out a bunch of close-range ignores to cover shooting. The points increase on the Winged Demon Prince doesn't seem to have stopped him getting spammed, and people doing well with him in top tournaments there. They might have a bit more competition with Mauler Fiends now. A couple of squads of Tormentors tends to be fairly mandatory. Sticky Objectives and Infiltrate are both great rules to have in an army. And then perhaps for some maybe picks, Lucius the Eternal, Fulgrim and Flawless Blades all do make their way into competitive lists, but maybe not quite as reliably as some of the other stuff. None of them are unusable though, particularly in casual play. For army issues, they do tend to be very fast and hit pretty hard, though if they get hit first or hit back in a convincing way, then they're going to take casualties pretty quickly. They do have some army limitations. They're not usually going to be able to deal with tough tanks and monsters at range, and really needs to close the distance and beat screens. And while Fulgrim is better than he was, it still feels like Games Workshop have further to go to make him a bit more of a strong centerpiece option for the army. It's perhaps best that he's not auto-include, but I still feel like he's on the underpowered side of things compared with where he really wants to be. Next up, and also on 47%, we have the Orks. They again have dropped down a couple of percentage points compared with the last meta. They seem to have similar sort of win rates both in casual and competitive, but don't seem to be making their way onto the top tables quite as much as some of the other armies. Only the 1-5 game first defeated initial run at this meta, so quite a lot worse than many factions out there. Plenty of people are still putting them on the table though. They're 12th most played out of the 28 armies, even if that might still be a touch low for Orks. Last balance pass, Games Workshop opted to make no points or rules changes. They'd had quite a few rules changes and updates previously, including the one that allowed Ghazghkull to join a big unit of boys that was pretty impactful. Currently the majority of strong army lists choose to go Warhorde. It's just very easy to get lots of value for that one. Extra melee valence from the detachment rule, good stratagems and options to allow your units to close with the enemy faster, and being able to turn on a bit of extra damage or defense doesn't hurt either. The vast majority of competitive lists do go for that, though the rest of their army archetypes do get played. Bully Boys, Tactical Brigades, Green Tide and Dread Mob all do see some play, and even the others beyond that see a few players, though for the most part none of these really tends to perform on the same level as Warhorde does consistently. For standout units, Commandos and Boss Snickrods are pretty excellent for infiltrating and skirmishing now. Commandos became way more efficient when they got to be able to split into 2 units. Ghazghkull plus Orc Boys is a staple to the vast majority of army lists. 20 of them and then maybe a big mech to hopefully get them to advance further and faster. And with Ghazghull's buffs for the units, even the regular choppers will be doing a fairly vast amount of damage. Plus 1 to hit and wound is pretty dangerous, and in the turn of the war they'll be able to sweep up multiple units of enemies most of the time. Then beyond that, various flavours of violence jumping out of trucks tends to be a good idea. Norbs Breaker Boys, Beast Snagger Boys and a Beast Boss, or maybe Mega Norbs and Bully Boys perhaps, usually led by bosses, and then typically jumping out of trucks or wagons, maybe Kill Rigs as another option for the Beast Snaggers. Otherwise, Flash Kits are just a generally powerful unit in most detachments, plenty of close range shooting and a good amount of damage 1 melee volume attacks, and then Gretchen are absolutely auto-includes to at least have 1 unit for the home field, perhaps another expendable one beyond that too. and then some Storm Boys can wing it around the board, helping to score some secondaries too. Despite having a fun buff to Ghazghkull Thraka, it still doesn't look like the Orks are particularly stand out in terms of overall power right now though. Not doing terribly, but certainly not stand out strong either. Perhaps the biggest criticism of them at the moment just feels like there's a lot of data sheets that are just very bad outside of their themed detachments. The Boggers, Plains and Walkers are all just pretty rarely used. And it's maybe a bit telling that they aren't even particularly strong inside their own thematic detachments, never mind outside that in Warhorde. Finally for this section we've got the Space Wolves, who are on 48% wins. That seems to be near enough the same as it was prior to the last balance pass. It's the same in casual play currently as well. They've had 3 big tournament runs or victories, and have played 18th most out of 28 armies, most of those feeling a bit kind of middle of the road for them. For their last balance updates, it was mainly good news. They had buffs to Bjorn the Fell-Handed, Grey Hunters, Iron Priests, Murderfang, the Venerable Dreadnought and the Wolfen Dreadnought, plus the changes to Space Marine units. Most of those did fall on units that weren't very strong before though. The best one was the help to Bjorn, who was already good. The other major changes that they had was the Saga of the Great Wolf, with its Logan Grimnar theme and the sort of Space Wolf style combat doctrines, and then Wolf Scouts also got a data sheet as well. Though at the points cost that it is at the moment, it hasn't really been very widely played, at least not compared with say regular Scouts. For the detachments being used in competitive play, it does seem like really quite a lot of people have taken up the Saga of the Great Wolf, liking the general theme of it, and having another Space Wolf detachment that looks fairly credible to have a go with. So far though, despite seeming to be the most played detachment for the Space Wolves currently, it really doesn't seem to be doing very well. People using it look like they've got win rates of around about 38 to 45%, depending on whether you're looking at competitive or casual or different sources. I don't know if there's an element of people just not having figured it out yet, or whether it's more a detachment that's fun to play and has enough things to make people want to choose this over Gladius, but that doesn't really seem to convert all that well to big wins. Otherwise for other ones, then it's Stormlance, then Beastlayer, then Gladius the next most played, and all of those seem to be doing at least better in terms of the win rates and numbers versus the Great Wolf one. Stormlance works rather well with Space Wolf Thunderwolves, which remain a very strong unit. Speaking of which, those Thunderwolves are just good in terms of overall big damage and defense style units, and move fairly fast up the board. Alongside them, Wolfguard Head Takers could be nice enough, perhaps jumping out for transports, and maybe going with either a Wolf Priest or Battle Leader. The Wolfguard Terminators are strong in the vast majority of lists, often with Ayak Rockfist along, or maybe Logan Grimnar to join them. Bjorn the Fell-Handed was in most lists before, and that hasn't changed with a points cut to him. It's nice to generate command points, and there's just a nice chunky fighty dreadnought beyond that. The Wolfen with the Thunderhammers and Storm Shields are nice, perhaps particularly in Beastlayer, when you can give them a Wolfguard Battle Leader to go along with, and then back that all up with some other Space Marine support, perhaps Combi Lieutenants, Intercessors, or Scouts, and maybe a bit of fire support if you feel like it. A Gladiator Lancer could go well with a Wolf Priest if you wanted. Overall at the moment they don't really feel like in the worst place of the world. It's just kind of weird to see the new detachment that's had a big uptake on the competitive scene, but not really much success there. Otherwise it still feels like despite Games Workshop nudging a few points cost around, most of the other units they buffed aren't particularly stand out. Feels like Grey Hunters could use a bit more, and Jarl Stormcaller could use some help as well. Moving on, next up we have the factions that are more in the mid-tier of Warhammer 40k. As ever, it's really quite nice to see a really good chunk of armies cluster around the sort of 49 to 50% for win rates, neither overpowered nor underpowered, at least with a good player with a good list. Some of these are a bit more notably good at punching up and winning grand tournaments compared with some, the Blood Angels perhaps most notably here. And if you play in more casual gameplay circles, bear in mind the Custodes have better win rates there than most, and outside of tournament play can be a challenge for many armies to handle. Adding these onto the chart, and here we have the Grey Knights and Dark Angels on 49%, and then Death Guard, Custodes, Blood Angels, Tau, Leagues of Votann and Sisters all on 50. First up for those, we have the Grey Knights. They're on 49% wins, pretty well the same as they were prior to the balance update, doing a little bit worse in casual play at 46% there it would seem. They've not been played very much in grand tournaments, looking like they're fourth from bottom in terms of taking them to tournaments, though that hasn't stopped the few people who are playing them doing rather well. No less than 5 people have managed to either win tournaments or go 5 games undefeated, which if you wait for that small play rate is actually quite impressive. It puts them at 5th by that metric, despite not a lot of enthusiasm to put Grey Knights on the table. People who are choosing to seem to be doing at least okay with them. They had very minimal balance changes last time around, Interceptors being nosed down a bit, as with the Purgation Squad. It didn't really feel like it changed lists in a big way there. For detachments being used, it's still mainly the Warpbane task force, with its big rerolls within your zones of control, and focus on Purifiers that tends to be the way people go. The Banishes one from the Codex seems to be the strongest of those, and it's the next most used. Plenty of people like it, and it's got a bit more use for Terminators, though broadly speaking since the Codex it just hasn't really done as well as Warpbane. For standout units, armies tend to go pretty heavy on Dreadknights, usually 3 or more split between the regular Nemesis ones or the Grandmasters. They'll get on well with the Purifier style rerolls in the Warpbane task force. 10 Purifiers and Crow is a bit of a staple, plus maybe more units to hand out the aura if you want. They can obliterate infantry pretty well, and are fairly savage in melee too. Some strike squads on interceptors tend to be a good idea for some utility. Strikes for sticky objectives and interceptors for being a fast-moving squad that can skirmish quite well. Razorbacks can be handy for interceptors or purifiers. If wanting Terminator bodies, then Paladins are a bit better than Terminators currently, and tend to get used a bit more in Banishers lists. They can hit fairly hard on the charge with a +1 damage, and for other notable characters, the Brotherhood Librarian sees a fair amount of play. He's got just good stats for the cost and a punchy shooting attack. He could lead Terminator units, though it's very reasonable just to go completely solo and be a nice cheap action doing deep striker who's still got a little bit of threat. Despite having quite a bit of the codex usable, it still doesn't really feel like there's a lot of enthusiasm for playing the army. I feel like the state of their model range and the expectation they're probably going to get an update at some point doesn't help with that. Gameplay wise, it feels like the biggest priority are that Terminator units could just use a boost. I feel like if the Brotherhood ones or Paladins were stronger in some way, then it might also even the balance up a bit between detachments too. They've definitely got some interesting stuff going for them with all their teleport shenanigans, though sometimes that only does help them out so much. He still needs to hold primary objectives, and it doesn't necessarily deliver them to melee super easily, which is often needed to get a chunk of their damage done. Next up, and also on 49% tournament win rates, we have the Dark Angels. Again, they're not really so very different from pre-updates, and seem to be fairly similarly successful in casual games as the tournament scene. They've had 3 top tournament performances with the 5-0 undefeated runs, though again that leaves them kind of low if you weight that per player, as they're quite a popular faction to take to tournaments at the moment, the 10th most played out of the 28 armies. The last balance update had Azrael nerfed slightly, though still easily worth including, and otherwise things were kind of light touch. The Ravenwing Black Knights went down to 80 points and are a fair bit more efficient at that, and also relevant from those generic space marine changes, the Stormspear Thunderstrike was buffed, which can be nice enough for +1 to wound for a bunch of unforgiven firepower. In their list at the moment, the Wrath of the Rock is easily the most played thing for the Dark Angels. It has some fun stratagems and some helpful ones to support Lionel Johnson and some Deathwing Terminators. It is maybe one that tends to have a little bit more success in the casual setting versus competitive ones though. The next 2 most played armies are Stormlance and Gladius, and they both seem to do a bit better, at least by the win rates, in tournament games. They've both got plenty of good stuff for supporting melee, and Stormlance works quite well with some of their Ravenwing units. Quite a few of their unique models are solidly playable at the moment. Deathwing Knights tend to be a mainstay, often with 2 or 3 units, maybe a squad of Inner Circle companions with Azrael or Judas here or something. Azrael's still great with his 4+ invulnerable save, farming command points, and buffing his units' damage. Lionel Johnson tends to be in the majority of lists. Fighting first with a massive bunch of melee can be a real problem for other close combat armies. Black Knights do seem to be seeing a bit more play down at 80 points rather than 90. There's all the standard Space Marine good stuff, and Wrath of the Rock might see a few people using Sternguard or Hellblaster shooting, both of which can get some interesting stuff out of the detachment synergies. Overall, for the most part, they aren't in too bad a spot. They do have a chapter-themed detachment that works well enough and does win grand tournaments. Perhaps for faction issues, it will be nice to have an update on some of the Ravenwing models, given that there's a good sense that they might get replaced at least fairly soon. For actual unit balance, though, it might be nice to see a few of their lesser played characters get a bit of attention. Things like Belial and Lazarus just don't see tournament play, and the regular Deathwing Terminators could afford a points drop as well. They just in no way compare with the Deathwing Knights. Moving on, and next up we have the Death Guard. Mortarion Sons have win rates of 50% at the moment, seeming to have risen up a couple of percent compared with last time around. Their performance seems to be fairly consistent between competitive and casual play. They're still one of the most played armies out there in 40k on the tournament tables currently, the 3rd most played faction in the game, so lots of enthusiasm to put them on the table, and it seems that they've been having their fair share of top table placings, 6 players managing to go 5-0 undefeated or win a tournament. That number's not super standout when weighted for the large amount of people who play them though. They didn't get any enormous changes in the last balance update. Rosh just went up a bit, the Land Raider dropped down. Their most popular detachment is still the Virulent Vectorium. Nice sticky objective support, some useful stratagems, and good enhancements for the Lords of Contagion and the 5+ Feel No Pain on the Demon Prince. Quite a lot of the rest are solidly playable though. Champions of Contagion, Mortarion's Hammer, and Taliban Summoners all do well. For more notable units, a unit of Deathshroud Terminators with a Lord of Contagion is hard to pass up. They can drop in at 6 inches if you can make your target afflicted, and then likely delete quite a lot of normal sized units in 40k. Poxwalkers are nice to have in the mid-board to get that affliction out to the enemies. Spawn can be nice enough trading units for a similar sort of job. Plague Marine combos jumping out of Rhinos can deal an absolutely colossal amounts of damage, maybe with the Biologist Putrefier and Foul Blight Spawn attached. Bloat drones with heavy blight launchers remain very nice firepower. They can be buffed by the Lord of Virulence for some reroll hits if you'd like to. Mephitic Blight Haulers, regular bloat drones, and Predator tanks also do well. Mortarion himself is usable. and plenty of lists find room for a lone tallyman camping in the backfield and farming up some command points. The vast majority of the roster is usable, they've got multiple playable detachments, and they seem to be doing fairly well in game currently. For the most part, it seems like Death Guard are doing fairly well here. They do have their weaknesses, like being slow moving and ideally wanting to get close to have maximal effect for their debuffs. Perhaps to nitpick things, it might be nice to see a bit more love for Plague Burst Crawlers, or maybe the Blight Lord Terminators, which always seem to be slightly overshadowed. There's definitely a lot of factions that have it worse though. Also on 50% tournament victories, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. They've not been particularly changed from pre-update, despite a few buffs that felt fairly meaningful. They had cheaper Custodian Guard, dropping all the way down to 150 for 4 of them. Alaris Terminators got another points cut, and a couple of the Cheap Sisters units got even cheaper. Quite nice for skirmishing and doing actions. Otherwise, for their metrics, they are one of the stronger armies in casual play, 53% win rates there, and that's one of the higher ones by those numbers, though classically they often tend to do a bit better in casual play versus competitive. Their still players have had some high placings with them, with 4 initial runs of 5-0 undefeated, and remain a fairly mid-popular faction, 14th out of the 28 in terms of play rate. For detachments, the majority of people are still using the Lines of the Emperor, giving you a boost to the wound roll for units that are isolated, and some nice stratagems for helping you skirmish in the midboard. Several other detachments see some competitive play though. Shield Host, Solar Spearhead, and Talons of the Emperor all get some good representation. The Shield Host with its direct damage buffs and other nice stratagems is the second most played. After quite a few waves of balance passes, the vast majority of the Custodes Codex is rather playable right now. Custodian Guard in particular have become a far more focal unit now they're quite less cheap. It's not too uncommon to see armies spamming them when they're effectively around about say 38 points per model. They can still be very nice with shooting combos with Kyria Draxus as well. Otherwise, for mainline damage dealers, Wardens with a Blade Champion will also do really well. The 4+ Feel No Pain can mean that they'll just have one turn where they shrug off most things. Trajan could be another option to lead them in Lines of the Emperor in particular. Their bikes and jump packs and the Virtus Praetors and Venatari are both nice in their own ways. Alaris Custodians have got a good mix of utility, with their anti-vehicle damage rules plus being able to teleport around the table. The Shield Captains are rather useful in the Lions detachment. It's well worth having some smaller units of Sisters of Silence to screen and score. The Calidus Assassin can be another popular choice for that. And then for some backfield firepower, the Caladius Grav Tank is heavy hitting, and at 220 points the Venerable Land Raider is rather usable as well. Overall, the majority of their units can work rather well if you want them to. Overall, it doesn't really feel like the worst place for them. They generally are going to be a stat check army as a little bit predictable with their marching up the board and fighting you with Guardian Spear approach. It might mean that they lack a bit of subtlety and are a bit random and coin flippy depending on how the 4+ invulnerable saves are treating you, but that certainly doesn't mean that they're easy to overcome and are still managing to win half their tournament games. Next up, and also on 50% win rates, we have the Blood Angels. That's increased by 2% compared with the previous meta, and they also seem to be fairly close to this sort of level in casual play. The Blood Angels got a big buff in the last balance update. Their Sanguinor got a touch cheaper, but the really important one was getting their Rage Cursed Onslaught detachment, which does seem to have taken over as the primary way to play competitive Blood Angels right now. It really helps out Death Company in particular, with the option to get a fairly silly amount of attacks out of them, and otherwise having some fairly similar supporting rules to Liberator Assault Group, extra attacks on the charge, more fuel battle shocks, and reroll ones to wound. With that detachment, they're certainly a big threat to the top tables. 9 players have either had 5-0 undefeated runs or have won tournaments with them. That's the 8th highest when weighted for play rate, and it does look like lots of people are choosing to take them to tournaments as a result. They're the 5th most played faction out of the 28. Rage Cursed Onslaught does seem to be what most people are going for, though both Liberator Assault Group and Angelic Inheritors are also solid enough detachments, but they certainly aren't doing quite so well by the competitive win rates right now. For strong units, Rage Cursed Onslaught lists often tend to have 3 squads of Sanguinary Guards, often going for these spears given that you don't have lance in that detachment, some of them backed up by jump captains, and it's fairly common to see a unit of 6 of them with the Fights First enhancement in them, or maybe with Dante along potentially. Then they tend to get backed up by several squads of Jump Death Company, Lamarti's leading a big block of 10 of them, and then potentially other chaplains leading more. Any other Space Marine skirmish units will do fairly well. Things like Jump Intercessors, Scouts and Intercessors can have a bit of melee punch in all the Blood Angels detachments, as well as just being pretty good full stop. It's fairly common for armies to take a small amount of Space Marine firepower, maybe something like a pair of gun tanks, though the Blood Angels unique units are also rivals for that role. Some using Bile Predators and their Flamestorm cannons as nice nuisance trading tanks, or Death Company Dreadnoughts, which maybe become a bit more useful when you've got chaplains around to ensure a bit of OC. Otherwise, they've got their cheap fighty Fights First lone operatives with Sanguinor and Mephiston. Both of those and Dante are pretty nice as well, though perhaps a bit less auto-include than they might have been in the past. Overall, looks like the Blood Angels are on pretty solid form right now. They've got one strong detachment and multiple other options that they can pivot to if they want to. Perhaps for any criticisms, the Foot Death Company are a bit lesser played. They have fairly big commitment units that require good estimation of what they can kill and what they can't, and they really don't want to get hit first if at all possible, or be forced to trade down by killing cheaper units. They're also a faction that has a lot of potential to struggle with Catan as well. Lots of their damage is damage 2, and the -1 damage can really mess with that. Next up, and also on 50%, we have the Tau Empire, again not really having changed in any huge way since the previous numbers that they had before the last balanced data slate. They're doing a little better in competitive versus casual, which often seems to be the way with Tau. Casual win rate's down a bit further at 47%, though not too far away. They're fairly popular to put on the competitive tables at the moment, being the 7th most played faction in tournaments, and again seem to be winning their fair share of big events as well. 5 players either winning or going 5-0 undefeated. Be a popular faction though, once again that's not when he waits for the numbers playing them. The last balance changes nudged a few things up and down. Fire Warriors and the Storm Surge were both buffed. The Riptide and Skyray were both nerfed slightly after the Riptide's recent increase to Strength 10. They have also had the recent addition of their 5 model stealth suits as well, which are still seen as pretty essential for the vast majority of army lists out there, but does mean that they're a bit less efficient in terms of spotting targets. Since the Codex's release, the Tau detachments have been kind of remarkably well balanced versus just about any other faction out there in 40k. Pretty much all of the ones in the Codex are usable and strong. Everything including the Kroot Hunting Pack can do fairly well in competitive play. Maybe Experimental Prototype Cadre being one of the most notable ones that's a bit weaker than the rest really. Even so, that still gets used as it's got some fun rules. Currently looks like Montcard might be the most played and seems to be doing rather well by the numbers, moving very quickly and hitting things hard with lethal hits. The Tau's datasheets are also fairly well balanced as well. In the right detachment, the vast majority of the Codex is playable. Riptides and their Strength 10 Ion Accelerators are still some of the very most auto-include units. It's not uncommon to see 3 of them per army list. Stealth suits are seen as rather mandatory for marking for fire support with their rerolls. Pathfinders are fairly excellent scouts and infiltrators with some interesting damage of their own. Kroot Carnivores are nice for sticky objectives. Vespids to bounce around the board doing secondary objectives. For mainline firepower, Hammerheads, Broadsides, the Ghost Kill and Skyrays all remain good. The Ghost Kill being extra nice as it's got lone operative so it can hand back, screen out the backfield and inflict its slightly mediocre damage from safety. Crisis suits have got plenty of interesting combos and get better in retaliation cadre versus elsewhere. Devilfish and Breachers can gun enemies off the mid-board objectives rather hard, and Piranhas can be nice interference scouts. The other Kroot units maybe don't tend to be too standout elsewhere, though Rampagers certainly aren't awful for their raw stats and get very nasty in auxiliary cadre or hunting pack. Again, Tau seem to be an army that's in a rather good spot right now. Pretty well balanced win rates, able to compete at the highest levels of the game, and pretty well the vast amount of their detachments and units usable in one form or another. There's quite a lot of creativity that you can do and different ways to play the forces of the greater good. Perhaps the main downsides there might be a little bit of a trickier army to command than some at more casual levels, needing to balance their level of aggression with their not so tough units and getting lines of sight versus not getting destroyed too early. Perhaps Riptides feel a touch on the obvious side as a way to go, spamming 3 of them currently, and Stealth Suits did have a small impact on the faction in terms of their rules rewrite, though it doesn't really look like it's hurt the Tau as a faction too much. Next up for armies balanced around the midpoint of Warhammer 40k, we have the Leaguers of Votann, also around 50% wins both in competitive and casual. A slightly lower mid-played faction at 16th out of the 28 armies in the game, and 4 either tournament victories or 5-0 undefeated runs, which isn't doing too badly per their play rate. Last update broadly had buffs for the Space Dwarfs. They had several of their lesser played units go down in points a bit, the Arcanist Evaluator, Buri Aidnason, the Karl and Sagittor all dropping down, and the Icon Steel Drax also dropped quite a bit, which was nice, given that they were a fairly solid unit already. The only nerf that they had was to the Bramfast Oathband, with the Trivarch Cyber Implant going up a bit, but given it can still do an apocalyptic amount of damage, it's not the worst in the world. For detachments, after the updates to the Hearthband post-codex, that's been gradually gaining more traction. For detachments most played in competitive settings, it's between that and the Needguard Oathband fairly well balanced, though it does seem to be the Hearthband with the higher win rates and getting slightly higher placings. In terms of the event standings right now, it's the one that revolves around Karl's and the Einherjar Hearthguard, though has some useful stratagems beyond that. It can make them hit very hard though and gives the Einherjar Hearthguard a 6-inch deep strike if you need it. Needguard Oathband has a lot of nice damage and defense though, and the Delve and Bramfast detachments also see some play as well. The army's got a fairly small roster, though most of it's usable enough. Some nice utility units between the Hernkin Jaegers split with a Capricus plus Hernkin Pioneers. Einherjar Hearthguard have some fairly solid shooting and can still be a melee threat with Concussion Gauntlets, and they're extra nice in the Hearthband. Brockhir Thunderkin, Ironkin Steeljacks and Chthonian Berserks are all decent enough damage dealers, and the Hecaton Land Fortress is rarely a terrible idea, though they're maybe not quite as auto-include as they used to be for Hearthband lists. Otherwise, plenty of the supporting characters are useful enough, Memnir Strategist and Uthar the Destined perhaps in particular. Again, they really seem like an army in a fairly good spot, good win rates and a fair amount of power, some top tournament performance and multiple detachments that they can do so, and most of their units are at least usable right now. For downsides, they're perhaps one of the factions that doesn't really tend to have quite so many sneaky tricks, fairly straightforward damage and defense, and while some of their units have good movement characteristics, the vast majority of them aren't exactly standout fast. Several of their guns are sort of medium to short range as well, and it can make them just a touch inflexible. It doesn't seem to be limiting them too much currently though. Finally for this section we've got the Adepta Sororitas, the Battle Sisters having dropped down to 50%. Last balance pass they were quietly becoming one of the stronger armies behind Admech, around about 55 or 56% wins, and that led Games Workshop to give them some fairly punishing feeling nerfs. The Canoness, Retributors, Sanctifiers, Celestian Sacrosants, the Hospitaller and more than Val herself all went up a bit. It certainly meant that they're not quite as standout as they were before, though it doesn't really seem to have absolutely dropped them quite as much as say Aeldari. Though so far they haven't really had so much top tournament success, just 2 of those high placings, and not particularly great when weighted for their play rate, even if they are one of the lesser played factions currently, at 22nd out of the 28. For army list currently, it's generally between the Hallowed Martyrs and the Champions of Faith as the standout ones. Hallowed Martyrs has lots of character focus, the ability to revive them, and direct melee units to attack what you want them to. Champions of Faith more focuses on the Paragon Warsuits and Celestian Sacrosants. So far it seems like the Champions of Faith have slightly better win rates currently, but both of the top performances have come from Hallowed Martyrs. For more staple units, Castigators tend to be handy for some volume fire with autocannons or battle cannons from the backfield. They can debuff enemies for extra AP as well. Despite a 15-point increase, the Paragons and Morven Val still remain very solid. It wasn't really a big percentage increase, and they can still absolutely annihilate the heart of the enemy army if they're able to activate fully. An Immolator splitting a unit of Battle Sisters in 2 is pretty efficient. It means that you can have a sticky objective squad for the home field, and then have a nice transport with some melters moving up the board. Celestian Sacrosants are still usable enough with a Hospitaller, though you might be a bit more tempted by other characters after the points increase there. Mycoflagellants can skirmish hard for the midboard, could maybe be a small unit squad to force enemies to attack them in Hallowed Martyrs. Retributors still seem to be seeing play despite the points increase, and Dominions and Sanctifiers still do alright as well, though are a bit less standout than before. Seraphim are also a decent utility unit. Finally, they've got lots of good characters to lead them. Junitharita with her command point farming and generally nice profile. Palatines can be made fairly fighty with a couple of enhancements, and the Caranesses are a nice mix of some melee damage plus their free stratagems. Despite the nerfs, they seem to be doing okay for general power. Again, they might be a harder army to play than some though. Fragile units that are reliant on careful trading and making use of a limited pool of miracle dice that can do some fairly crazy things, but at a precious cost. And several units going up in points cost slightly will just emphasise this even more than before. Next up I chose to put the armies between 51 and 52% as sort of upper mid factions, and it seems like there wasn't really too much here, though I thought for this one we'd also talk about the Space Marines as well. Overall, as a faction, they've got 50% win rates, as they do feel like a case where Space Marine Army can mean many different things, several other chapters being less standout, but certainly Ultramarines and Victrix Honor Guard being absolutely top tier in 40k right now. Putting them on the chart, here we have Space Marines at 50%, and then Admech and Deathwatch on 51%. For the Space Marines, their 50% win rates are fairly unchanged compared with the previous meta, and don't seem to be too far behind that in terms of casual win rates on Goonhammer. The standout tournament stats they have though are that they're the most played competitive army right now. They always tend to be at least fairly popular, though given they've got the top tier build with the Ultramarines and their Honor Guards right now, there's good reason to put them on the table. The other chapters have had some interesting rules drops too, but then between them they are winning a vast amount of tournaments and going undefeated at others. In total so far it looks like there's been 21 players that have either gone 5-0 undefeated for the first 5 games or won a tournament, which even when you weight it for their excessive play rate is one of the single best in the game. They're coming in at 3rd as that metric right now. The last balance changes have had quite a lot of updates for the Space Marines. They had lots of nerfs to Shadowmark Talon. The good jump captain enhancement was nerfed. Vanguard Veterans, Devastator Centurions and Ethon Shan also all went up, and unfortunately that seems to have kicked the Shadowmark Talon into doing far worse in competitive play once again. Otherwise they buffed Aggressors, Eradicators, the Lieutenant, the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike and Assault Terminators, and the Victrix Honor Guard first had their points go up and then had their points go down a bit again, though Narata gave them 3 wounds rather than 4. At the same time as that, we had the 3 new detachments from the Titus expansion, and we also gained Titus and the Wardens of Ultramar's new datasheets, and in particular the Wardens of Ultramar are just a ridiculously efficient unit at 90 points for that many wounds on the table. Between all that, it seems to have shaken out that Ultramarines are still doing all very well. The lists that are winning the vast majority of tournaments are Gladius and Blade of Ultramar ones, the Ultramarines version that's a slightly different take on the previous. Blade of Ultramar does have some interesting stuff with Marnie's Calgar allowing repetitions of doctrines, but does lose the fight on death stratagem, which is kind of handy for Victrix Honor Guard. If you take those two alone though, even with the Gladius being sort of like the starter Space Marine detachment pretty much, they're still sitting on 54% win rates at grand tournaments, so if you tried to split it into Ultramarines, they're certainly fighting for one of the strongest factions in the game. The other most standout detachment seems to be Salamanders with either Firestorm or Forgefather Seekers more likely. Forgefathers has also been a good detachment, and the last balance pass had a few helpful things for it, perhaps particularly Eradicators going down, though some of the other things helped out too. For standout units, the vast majority of the Ultramarine characters are really quite playable. As mentioned, Victrix are great with their surge moves and just big damage dealing, and fairly tanky stat lines with a -1 to wound. They might often get backed up by Marnie's Calgar in Gravis armor with his other Honor Guard. Both of these Sicarius datasheets are nice enough. They quite like the automatic 6-inch reactive move on such a powerful unit. Uriel Ventris has his command point debuff, and Rabute Gilliman is pretty game-changing between his multiple Oaths of Moment, discount stratagems, and just general fightiness. The Wardens of Ultramar will be an absolute staple for the Ultramarines too. Then with boosted Oath of Moment on the go, gun tanks are generally a good idea. Ballistas Dreadnoughts, the Gladiator Lancer, Repulsor Executioner, the Vindicator, and the Stormspeeder Hammerstrike are all fairly strong options there. And then Space Marines have got a wealth of different objective scoring units to fill various battlefield roles. The Combi Lieutenant, Space Marine Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors and Jump Intercessors can all have good roles, and there's really quite a lot of other units that are maybe not enormously stand out compared with some of those, but are still very, very playable. Salamander's lists will take their two named characters, go heavy on Infernus Marines, and likely some Eradicators and Transports, likely having room for a Land Raider Redeemer as well. Overall, the main issue for Space Marines, as is often the case, is that there often tends to be a big disparity between an average Space Marine list that any one player might have, and a tournament optimized one, which can be quite scary. Keeping up with a meta build if you really want to can be expensive and time consuming, and just with a sheer number of them there's a good chance that quite a lot of the chapters are underwhelming for a fair bit. For power levels at the moment it certainly feels like it's Ultramarines first, then maybe Salamanders perhaps after that, and then the rest just not really doing quite so well, even if they do have some fun stuff. It seems that the Victory Exchange to 3 wounds hasn't done too badly for the Ultramarines though, and still looks like they're going to be one of the strongest armies for a while going forward. Otherwise, on 51% wins, we have the Adeptus Mechanicus. They were the ones that were ruling the roost prior to the last balance update, have dropped down 7% since then. That was caused by points increases to core Iron Striders, Taraxi Skystalkers, and the Sicarian units. They did feel like quite targeted nerfs to the things that seem to be most auto-include. Otherwise, they have sort of middling casual win rates at 48%. They aren't played by too many people on the competitive scene, though they weren't even at the height of their power. Just not that many people collect Admech, and they're expensive to build up an army of. And so far they haven't had loads of tournament success this time around. 2 event wins or 5-game undefeated runs, placing 18th when weighted per play rate. For detachments, it still seems to be Halo Screed as the most popular. Hunter Cohort also doing fine, though maybe a little bit lesser played than before perhaps. Halo Screed does a good job of supporting multiple units that the Admech have to offer. Some nice things on offer like Advance and Charge from their direct override style things, and some of their stratagems can be pretty efficient for some Cataphoron damage dealers. In current lists, Core still remains fairly auto-include in the vast majority of armies, handing out his Admech style Oath of Moment for big rerolls, and still having a fair bit of value for his model himself. The Skitarii troops are needed for buffs, Rangers played a bit more than Vanguard. Heavy firepower and tank busting comes from Scorpius shooting or Iron Striders with las cannons. Cataphoron destroyers can do rather well with core rerolls built in as well, plus a Tepris Manipulus maybe with an enhancement. The Taraxi and Infiltrators are still excellent for scoring, screening and skirmishing, and Rust Stalkers are still a nice melee units to focus buffs around, with their damage 2 weapons cutting through a bunch of medium infantry. You could stage them out of Scorpius Dune Riders if you want to. So far it doesn't look like the Admech are having too bad a time of it post nerfs. They're certainly not tearing up the top tables anywhere near as much as they were, but at the same time don't appear to have fallen too low, with pretty reasonable win rates and still a bit of success at the top levels of play. A few units still feel a bit on the overshadowed side of things. Fulgurite Priests, the Onager Dune Crawlers versus the other firepower, and Cerberus Sulphurhounds maybe. And it still does feel like a bit of an unusual place for the faction to be in, with Core being quite so mandatory with the power of his rule, though at the same time would feel pretty painful to jack up his points cost even further. Next up, and also on 51%, we have the Deathwatch. They don't seem to have moved too much compared with the last balance update, and seem to be fairly similar here for casual win rates at 49%. Deathwatch have a tiny player base and still seem to be played 27th out of the 28 armies, so vastly underplayed compared with most, though it does look like that small group of players has been doing very well on the tournament scene. No less than 4 of them have either managed to win a grand tournament or go 5 games undefeated, and that means that if you weight that number per play rate, then they're placing first there, though admittedly that is quite swingy, as any one player doing well can have an enormous effect on the overall number there. The last balance changes had some positives and negatives. Perhaps the biggest nerf was the Indomitor kill team going up by 15 points. It certainly didn't make it into a weak unit, but as a unit that's often taken in multiples, any increases are a little on the painful side. Devastator Centurions being nerfed could be a unit that was relevant with the Teleportarium, though the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike being buffed was handy enough. Fairly useful to make Deathwatch style shooting helpful against monsters and vehicles. It still seems the vast majority of competitive players are using their Blackspear detachment. I was wondering if people might experiment with the Bastion task force at all. That's got some good support for battle line units, which felt like the Deathwatch could make use of. So far though, nowhere near as many people are using it for the Deathwatch compared with the Templars, sticking with the Black Spear with its damage buffs, nice stratagems for amping up range damage or teleporting multiple kill teams around, and 3 pretty excellent enhancements as well. For standout units, the kill teams are as ever the main focus, Indomitor still perhaps the most common. Deathwatch veterans are a nice datasheet as well, with those heavy thunderhammers and some close range shooting that could be joined by Watchmasters or Judases. Terminators are a nice mix between their heavy weapons and a bit of melee threat as well, and most of the other kill teams are usable enough. Then they're likely to have some support units, maybe Infiltrators, Intercessors, the Combi Lieutenant, or Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, though there's plenty of other things too. It still feels like perhaps their biggest issue as a faction is their odd place in 40k in general, surviving through a balance patch, and with most of their datasheets not things that Games Workshop directly sell. People might be kind of nervous as to how they get reinterpreted next edition, particularly with Games Workshop briefly trying to fold them into Codex Imperial Agents for a bit. It doesn't help people want to collect a faction that's already kind of niche. I still feel like it's a shame that the Corvus Blackstar doesn't get a buff as well. Given it's just one of a few unique models for the faction, it's a bit unfortunate it's basically caught up in the aircraft rules where they're never allowed to be good. Moving onwards and upwards though, and now we're getting into the armies that seem to be doing really well in Warhammer 40k currently. These ones with win rates between 53 and 55%, with just the one faction looming above them. Most of these are just doing really well on every metric, really great win rates and plenty of event wins. Perhaps the exception to them seems to be the Genestealer Cult, which have infiltrated the mix. They're lesser played without quite so much top tournament success, but it does look like their small group of dedicated players are doing rather well. I would suspect that a good chunk of these will be at more risk of balance changes though, at least for some of their meta builds or strongest stuff. Putting them on the win rate chart here, and here we have the Drukhari with 53%, the Guard Thousand Suns and Genestealer Cult with 54%, and then Chaos Demons on 55%. First up we've got the Drukhari, tournament win rates of 53% and having risen up plus 6% from the previous meta. Casual game performance being a bit behind that, more like 50-50. They're played 15th most out of the 28 factions in grand tournaments, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it really isn't too bad for them. And so far it looks like their players have had 8 of those top tournament placings, which is certainly right towards the top on any metric, though 6th when weighted per play rate. What's interesting is that the Drukhari surging up doesn't really seem to have been so much to do with balance changes. They got a cheaper Ravager, a pricier bigger Reaver unit, and the ability for the Hand of the Archon to be split by Venoms. But the main thing that drove it was the rise of the Spectacle of Spite, more and more people gradually cottoning on to this being the strongest way to play Drukhari. Post-Codex, it was the Reaper's Wager being used the most, and Spectacle of Spite being far lesser played along with Kabbalite Cartel. But now in grand tournaments at least, it's the Witches that are being played by far the most. The detachment's really quite strong. It gives some nice generic stat line buffs to the Witches with its combat drugs, useful damage buffs when they get to melee, and help getting them there with other stratagems. And one particularly scary one is the ability to charge out of sequence in the enemy turn for 2 command points. There's not really anything else in 40k that can do that quite so powerfully as these. The Reaper's Wager and the Kabbalite Cartel are the next most played, but generally have worse performance and win rates being far lower. For their standout units, the majority of their datasheets are really solid enough if you're playing Reaper's Wager or another balanced detachment. In Spectacle of Spite though, the keywords mean that you'd be focusing around the Witches. You tend to have Lilith Hesperax, maybe one or more Succubi with enhancements, multiple squads of 10 Witches, a good chunk of them split into 5s with Venoms, and then likely some big blocks of Hellions and squads of Reavers. The Hellions being some main damage dealers, the Reavers being able to strike out super far with their huge movement. Raiders and Venoms can get them there, more Venoms than Raiders in most lists, though there's often at least one Raider for being able to stage squads out of, Witches get to disembark 6 inches, so really quite a vast threat range there. Scourges are hard to go wrong with firepower that you can move, shoot, move so they can not get shot back. Mandrakes give you infiltrate units that can fade away around the board with pain tokens. A single Kronos is rarely a bad idea to get a few more of those as well. Lady Malice can help with redeploys. She's got that annoying command point debuff rule and can be a fairly powerful melee threat with some Incubi too. And otherwise, outside of Spectacle of Spite, the Archon, Kabbalite Warriors, Drazar and other things like Talos Pain Engines can do well, though aren't as common to see in the Witch Cult detachment. It feels like the biggest issue for the Drukhari is that their best build is a niche one that a lot of players won't have all those Witch Cult units to run optimally. I feel like it often has a bit of a better feeling as well for one of the most played detachments to not be super keyword restricted, and as a result I wouldn't be too surprised to see nerfs either to the detachment or some of its standout units. When taken alone, it does look like Spectacle of Spies is one of the strongest things in 40k currently, win rates around 57% or so, and as we've seen, loads of tournament wins. Next up, we've got the Astra Militarum, the guard basically having their entire fortunes turned around by gaining one incredibly powerful detachment in the Grizzled Company. The impact of that one has caused them to flip from being one of the weaker factions by the numbers to one of the strongest, jumping from 46% wins up to 54%. Maybe a bit more balanced than 50-50 with the Goonhammer's casual win rates, but the detachment certainly seems to have got lots of guard players out in force playing their army. They're now the second played army out of 28 factions, just behind Marines, and it's added up to 10 tournament victories or high placings. One of the most in raw numbers, though it is a little less impressive when you weight it for how many people are playing them right now, dropping down to 9th out of the armies there. It's still on the upper end though. For strong army lists, Grizzled Company has immediately become absolutely dominant, which did seem kind of likely when we saw the rules for it. Its detachment rule is just fairly god tier, getting an extra order for every single officer, and on top of that a potentially big damage buff on units that get ordered. It means that as well as all the stuff that's normally strong for guard, it can support some other unusual things as well. It means that artillery is weirdly punchy here, as are melee units like Rough Riders. On top of that, there's some nice enough shooting stratagems, some armour of contempt for tanks at range. Borgrim with a commissar can allow them to get ordered and get lots of extra damage, and Kazakin with their built-in orders will enjoy swooping in and blasting things with special weapons. Combined Arms and Hammer of the Emperor were the two most played before, and there are still people using Combined Arms, but they're far rarer than Grizzled Company in tournaments currently. For stronger units, a lot of core damage dealing is done by some heavy battle tanks, either Rogal Dawns or their tank commanders, plus several of the Rust variants, the Vanquishers maybe being fairly standout. Hellhounds can light the way with some stripping cover. Kazakin are excellent jumping out of transports, and they do well in most of the guard detachments with some punchy special weapons, and Rough Riders and Borgrin hit extra hard here. Kaschan jungle fighters can scout into the midboard to seize it with a bunch of OC. Scout sentinels are helpful for that role as well, though tend to be far better outside of Grizzled Company rather than within. And at the back you can have a Vox command block if you want, Cadians plus command squads to sticky objectives, and then either Creed or maybe more likely Lord Solar Leontus, able to broadcast extra orders that give damage buffs at a long distance. Gaunt's Ghosts are an excellent utility unit as well, being able to jump on and off the board and be a good combination of a Calidus Assassin while also having some range damage and a bunch of other tricks and more orders. Overall, it does seem like things are working out really well for the guard at the moment. They seem to be in a very strong place overall and might certainly catch some nerfs. It does feel a bit on the unusual side that Grizzled Company itself is quite so obviously stronger than the rest of the detachments though. The detachments maybe weren't super balanced before, but this kills any semblance of it. And it feels to me like if they want to get the others played, they'd either have to buff a great number of them or nerf Grizzled Company itself. Otherwise, it would be nice to see a bit of help for some of the neglected guard datasheets, Lord Marshal Dryer, and some of the utility artillery such as the Manticore or Wyvern. They do have a fair few units that are rather underwhelming. Next up, and also on 54% wins, we have the Thousand Sons. They've risen up an extra plus 5% compared with the previous meta. Are doing fairly well on the top tables with 6 tournament victories or 5-0 undefeated runs. That places them 7th when you weight it per their small play rates. There's still not loads of players out there for them, ranked 21st out of the 28 armies. The Thousand Sons had their very powerful codex, were one of the stronger armies in the game for a bit, but then got some fairly brutal nerfs. Despite that though, they didn't really drop quite as far as a lot of people were fearing. Very lesser plays, but people were still having some okay success and doing alright with a few more detachments, particularly Rubrique Phalanx and the buffed Scarab Occult Terminators. Then Games Workshop gave them a whole bunch of points cuts to a range of units, small Rubric squads, the Sorcerer, Zangor Enlightens, the Mutalith Beast, several of the vehicles, and the Lord of Change and Fate Weaver. The effect on any one unit hasn't been enormously dramatic, but across an army that does give you a fair few more points to work with, and seems to have had them rise up. Grand Coven with its magical damage buffs, Umbrellific Crystal, and nice support for Magnus is one of the strong detachments, as is Rubrique Phalanx with lots of nice stratagems and good stuff for Rubric Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators. With the changes though to help some of the vehicles and the buffs to the Lord of Change and Fate Weaver, some are using Warp Forged or Change Host. Currently after the waves of buffs and nerfs, pretty well most of the unique units for the Thousand Sons are very usable. Magnus tends to be strong in Grand Coven, though not quite so powerful elsewhere. Sorcerers and Infernal Masters leading Rubric squads can be scary damage dealers, particularly when buffed to the nines with all the stacking rules that you can get between the army rule and detachment things. Jumping out of Rhinos can be a way to get them there and buff their damage further. They've got quite a lot of good units for screening and scoring, Zangors for scouting, Enlightened just as nice cheap skirmishers, Sekitar robots to infiltrate, and Spawn are a bit more take or leave though nice and cheap. Mutalisks can still be a powerful centre of the army. Their Feel No Pain and Invulnerable save soaking up a fair bit of fire. The Predator Annihilator can be a solid enough source of anti-tank, and Scarab Occult Terminators with Sorcerers might be a really big investment, but they can put out a fairly massive amount of firepower and aren't trivial to take down in return. Some Rubrique Phalanx lists of them go really heavy, with anything up to 30 of them. Again, as an army they seem to be in a good spot, multiple usable detachments, pretty well all their unique datasheets really quite usable even if they're not all standouts. For army weaknesses they can tend to be a little on the slow side outside of magical shenanigans, but they can certainly bring the damage between all the mortal wounds and big stacking damage buffs. They do tend to be quite a big thinking army though, with some fairly major decisions with how you use their roster of spells, and if you're less experienced with them can be more easy to get them right or wrong. Next up, and also it seems on 54% wins, we've got the Genestealer Cults. They seem to have gained a few percentage points on last time around, despite getting basically no changes whatsoever in the balance pass, though I would bear in mind that with these win rates data is fairly low with them, as with Deathwatch, they are the third least played faction in the game. Their high win rates do seem consistent over casual play though, and Goonhammer they have 54% wins, and that's from a dataset of over 1,000 games. Clearly the cult players are doing something right, though that hasn't translated so much to top event wins just yet. Just the two are either tournament wins or 5-0 undefeated runs. I believe one of those was with Final Day. For their detachment, in the balance pass before this, they had a bunch of their Biosancted Broodsurge units helped out. That's still the most played. And then Final Day and Host of Ascension both see play and genuinely have some good stuff that push the army in really quite a different way. Biosancted Broodsurge is all about the melee, with Aberrants, Pure Strains and Patriarchs, and the Biophagus leading some hybrids perhaps. Final Day adds in Tyranid Vanguard things, and particularly lone operatives. Their units can buff the shooting of Genestealer Cult pretty hard, or their melee. And Host of Ascension is still pretty great with the jumping out of Deep Strike with ambush tactics, and obliterating the enemy with some firepower combos, and more nice enhancements to get a punchy squad to melee too. Otherwise, for generally strong datasheets, it's worth having some small units of Acolytes to flame things and be small unit support. Achilles Ridge Runners can debuff the enemy with their heavy mortars, nice in support of basically whatever, and Metamorph, since the decreases are just quite a strong datasheet. Overall, looks like the Genestealer Cults have been doing fairly well so far on a kind of low-key level, which feels all very appropriate for them as the guerrilla warfare faction of 40k. Again, they're an army that's considered maybe a slightly higher skill faction to play, with a lot of decisions and the game in your control, but units that have the potential to be fragile and not enjoy bouncing if they're alpha struck. I do kind of wonder if the high win rates are a bit representative of the player population as well. They're an army that maybe attracts 40k veterans a bit more so than newbies for the most part. Then seemingly with second highest win rates in 40k right now, we have the Chaos Demons. They're on 55% currently, so have risen up 4% compared with previously, and that seems consistent over competitive and casual play. In competitive events, they're the 11th most played faction currently, and have also managed to get 11 players with either 5-0 undefeated runs or tournament victories, and when weighted per play rates, that puts them right towards the top. Third highest when weighted per play rate, so really quite a good chance to top grand tournaments here. The thing that made them rise up was the buffs to the Lord of Change and Kairos Fateweaver. Their damage output got fairly significantly stronger, with flat damage 2 and 3 on their attacks, and a bit more range on the secondary weapon of the Lord of Change. They did go up in points alongside that, but overall it was still a big win. At the same time, there were some cheaper Keepers of Secrets and Shalaxi Hellbane. It looks like at least one person has had some good success with the Legion of Excess with them. A couple of the Nurgle standout units were nerfed slightly, with Rotigus and the Great Unclean One with the Endless Gift both going up in points. Appropriately, with the changes to the Lord of Change, the Scintillating Legion has jumped to be one of the most played and most powerful detachments that the Demons have. That's the one way you can ping Flux token rerolls between both armies in quite a big way. And the Demons have got powerful stratagems with the option to be able to pull units from melee and return them to reserve, which isn't something that most armies can do. There's also quite a powerful ranged damage buff as well. Otherwise, the Demon Incursion is still going strong. It can deliver lots of units to melee really close, and does well with most of the greater demons. And beyond that, Plague Legion and Shadow Legion also get some play, and again seem to be doing alright on tournament tables. For stronger units, the Scintillating Legion will often take 3 Lords of Change, Kairos Fateweaver, and back them up with some Screamers and Flamers. You can also have a punchy Demon Prince with an enhancement there. Elsewhere, Be'lakor and the other greater demons are all fairly solid primary damage dealers. Bloodthirsters and the Great Unclean One variants are still nice, and for objective support and board control, Nurglings can do cheap infiltrating, Plaguebearers can bring sticky objectives, Nurgle Beasts are nice cheap interference things with Scout, and Flesh Hounds have the potential to bound on and off the board doing secondary objectives if you'd like them to. Perhaps for downsides, they do tend to rely on big single models in the greater demons that can hurt a bit on the objective game with having few activations, and it feels like any army relying on big single models to get the job done might not do well against Necron Catan. though I do suspect with this sort of performance there's probably going to be some nerfs coming for the Lord of Change in particular, and potentially Fate Weaver as well. That only leaves one, and to be honest I'm sure most people would predict that Necrons were going to top the charts here, given that they've had a pretty radical boost to their faction with the sheer power that C'tan had, never mind new detachments and Necrosaur Amantar as well. I thought we'd take a look at the few weeks of play that we've had so far since the detachments went live. Perhaps unsurprisingly it does look like we've got enough Grand Tournament data to make that meaningful, around about 700 games or so, given that due to the sheer power of the C'tan it's had lots of Necron players out in force. Prior to the C'tan buffs, the Necrons were already doing pretty well. 50% win rates, though it now seems they've risen all the way up to 58 so far, and also seem to be a powerhouse on the casual tables as well, around 35% wins from Goonhammer. The new C'tan and other new detachments have also made their presence felt on the top tables. It seems they've had either 14 top event placings or 5-0 undefeated initial runs, and if you weight that by the play rates, that has them second by that metric, and that figure includes plenty of time before the C'tan buffs as well. Then finally for competitive play rate, it looks like they're the 4th most played so far overall for the entirety of this meta, though as a few more people get their list together and no doubt receive their Nightbringer and Necrosaur models, that number's probably going to rise. They were the 2nd most played last weekend, overtaking Guard and being just behind Space Marines, and given that so far they're looking like the objectively strongest faction, I expect that number to rise higher. I wouldn't be too surprised to see them beating out Space Marines. The last balance changes didn't give them anything at all at the Christmas update, and they weren't in the worst position at that point, multiple viable detachments and plenty of good datasheets. The really big change was the C'tan buffs though. Giving them either 8-inch or 10-inch movement was a very nice boost to their mobility, but for some reason they also decided to make them fairly vastly tougher against the vast majority of normal weapons in Warhammer 40k. The extra wounds that they gained basically mean that they're tougher against damage 2, damage 3, and pretty well equivalent against damage d6 weapons. The only things that got better at killing them are the truly massive firepower guns, things like Leman Russ Vanquishers, Tyranid Tyrannifexes, and melter weapons with d6 plus 2. But most of those weapons weren't actually particularly stand out in killing C'tan anyway. The 4+ invulnerable save that you can command point reroll really does mean that those guns aren't super reliable against them. Basically they gain boosted speed and mobility, and plenty of them gain some interesting extra stuff like better damage as well. And all of that came for a far smaller points cost than I was expecting. That's not all though, as they also gained Necrosaur Amantar as really quite a powerful datasheet with fights first, a awesome melee threat, and a very good buff to have in the centre of your army with the sustained hits thing. And a couple of the new detachments look like they're very relevant in competitive play as well. The Pantheon of Woe being the one to support C'tan, both helps them and helps them buff other things, was always going to be an interesting one with the sheer power of those datasheets. And the Cursed Legion detachment is also rather nice as well. Its +2 strength buff does a lot of interesting things to plenty of datasheets, and there's lots of good support for destroyers beyond that. It does seem that both of those are getting used in competitive play, the Pantheon of Woe more so than the Cursed Legion, though both of them are doing pretty well for win rates in general. Beyond that, both the Starshatter Arsenal and Awakened Dynasty are still seeing some good play, and they're both doing well. Starshatter seems to be doing the best out of the two, maybe supporting the C'tan a little bit better versus Awakened, but all are seeing some good success on the top tables. Overall, you wouldn't be too surprised to hear that C'tan seem to be basically auto-include in the vast majority of Necron lists. It looks like outside of Pantheon of Woe, the sweet spot seems to be around about 2 of them, usually some combination of Nightbringer, Void Dragon and Deceiver, which all have good rules now. The Deceiver got leveled up pretty massively, and that small base doesn't hurt. The Transcendent is still interesting enough, and can be rather useful in the Pantheon lists. Beyond that, Necrons just have lots of solid units to support them with. Wraiths with Technomancer can be another durability combo. The Silent King can be another alpha level threat, though people might have to pick and choose between him and extra C'tan these days. Doomsday Arcs are solid fire support, and can work well with the Silent King, both of those doing well in Starshatter. A warrior block isn't the worst thing to have to basically guarantee a mid-board objective for quite some time. The usual combo tends to be Orican the Diviner, a Royal Warden, and maybe Cryptothralls or Tomb Crawlers, plus about as much reanimation support as you can give them between Ghost Arcs, Reanimators, and an Overlord on a Catacomb Command Barge. For skirmish units, you've got options like Ophidian Destroyers to burrow on and off the board, Infiltrating Flayed Ones, the Hexmark's quite a nice datasheet, or cheapish Deep Striking Deathmarks. There's lots of good character choices that can be extra nice in Awakened Dynasty with a chance to resurrect them, things like Imatech, Lone Scorpet Lords, Necrosaur Amantar, or Illuminor Zaraz. Both the Locust Destroyers and the Heavy Destroyers are nice enough fire support, and the Canoptech Reanimator is just pretty useful to have full stop. If it gets to activate on C'tan, that's a lot of ridiculously valuable wounds returning to the board. Most of those options were really quite strong and usable before, but not to the point of making Necrons overpowered. It basically feels like just adding in the immense extra power of C'tan really have tipped the balance for them. While I'd certainly not rate Necrons as unbeatable, the C'tan do have their weaknesses with being able to be screened and not having that much OC and things. if they're played well alongside good supporting elements, or if they're just thrown in en masse against casual players who might not be able to do all the technical movement things that you might need to beat them, then the enemies of the Necrons are in for a bad time. It was perhaps a bit disappointing to see Catan get quite this strong with so little points increase. Just a bit annoying to have Necrons buffed to the point where they're probably single strongest faction in the game, rather than just competing to be one of the top ones. I'd be amazed if multiple Catan don't get some pretty serious points hikes or rules changes in the near future. I guess probably at the next balance update, though it's not impossible Games Workshop could pull an emergency nerf if they want to deal with them sooner. In any case, here's just a roundup of a few of the overall metrics. Here are the raw numbers for some overall GT event wins or first 5 game undefeated runs. It's Space Marines leading the way here, then Necrons with their recent top performance, and then Chaos Demons and Astra Militarum after that. At this point, most factions have had some sort of success on this ladder, though there are still some without. Both of the Knight armies look like they're yet to score, as are the Black Templars, and Tyranids and Orks aren't doing so well here either. It perhaps makes those a bit more meaningful to weight them for the amount of players that are using them though, as if you just have loads of players turn up to a grand tournament, it just raises the odds that one of them is going to be of that faction anyway. Weighted per player, technically Deathwatch are on top, though given their tiny player base, it feels a bit less meaningful. The Grey Knights are quite high here too, in a similar sort of situation. Outside of those, for your best chance to win grand tournaments or go undefeated at them, it looks like it's Necrons, Demons, Space Marines, Drukhari, Thousand Sons, Blood Angels and Guard here. It's a bit more meaningful for the factions that have got lots of players, and bear in mind that this one's just a bit rough and ready. It's going to be very dependent on just a few players doing well or badly. Then here's the play rate for the armies at grand tournaments. These ones in numbers of games played by my count so far. Space Marines are very much out in front with all their Victrix stuff, plus the other content that they have released fairly recently for other chapters. Then Astra Militarum with their Grizzled Company, Death Guard, Necrons, Blood Angels and World Eaters after that. Though as mentioned, with the way that Necrons are going, they'll be moving up the ladder very quickly. Then finally, here are the overall win rates in grand tournaments at Warhammer 40k right now. As has often been the case in 10th edition, really not in the worst place in the world for game balance. Lots of factions in a pretty reasonable spot. There are some armies that just look like they're nosing out the front though. A bit of a top plateau with armies like Drukhari, Guard, Thousand Sons, Demons, and then certainly Necrons. Though these ones do sort of obscure some top performers like Space Marines, who certainly have some pretty excellent win rates with their Gladius and Blade of Ultramar. Certainly feels like the Imperial Knights are in a place where they could do with some help as well. In any case though, let me know what you make of the current state of Warhammer 40k. How does it feel to be playing your faction right now? I look forward to hearing all your thoughts, insights or other things I might have missed down in the comments below. I'll leave that there for now though. Thanks to Neon Forge Studio for sponsoring this one. As mentioned, they're a commission painting studio based in Poland, though can ship worldwide. As you can see, they've got a fair bit of cool stuff in their back catalogue. If you want to reach out to a quote for them for painting a cool centerpiece or even an entire army, the link will be down in the video description. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. That's it for this one though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. That's the main thing that keeps these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing occasional videos early, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.